So I've created this beginning of a track in Maschine. Actually, I have two Maschine plugins loaded into Ableton Live, and together they sound like this. So basically that's a 4-bar loop that has a lot of work to be done. The goal was to integrate what I had created in Maschine with Ableton Live so I could continue my work in Ableton. So the end result looks something like this. As you can hear, it sounds exactly the same. But you will also notice that all the sounds from Maschine are now routed into separate tracks in Ableton Live. So I can control the faders from Ableton, add extra plugins and stuff like that. So basically, where we had 2 instances of Maschine in the previous track, we now have 32 tracks, so 16 tracks for instance 1 and 16 tracks for instance 2. And I've even added a drum rack, so we can control the drums, the pads in Maschine from Ableton Live or Ableton Push. As you can see here, we have Maschine on the left, Push on the right, with the drum rack in Ableton loaded up. As you can see on the left, the pads in Ableton Push are triggering the pads in Maschine. This allows us to even create a sequence. So for example, let's take this hi-hat and just program a beat into the sequencer of Ableton Push and have it play together with the sounds coming out of Maschine that are actually being controlled by the clips in Ableton Live. Later on, you can also extract the patterns that you created on Push and map them to the correct sounds in Maschine. So basically, from this point on, we have left the Maschine environment and are returning to the Ableton Live environment without having to go to the process of recording Maschine into Ableton. So Maschine in this project is still running. I still have 2 Maschine instances running, but they're just being controlled by everything you see here. So let's return to our previous project, and I'll show you how it's done. Okay. So we'll just, for the sake of this tutorial, we'll just split up this instance of Maschine and leave the green one as it is. So let's move this over to the side. So the first thing you have to do, that has already been done here obviously, is create a new MIDI track in Ableton Live and then load an instance of Maschine onto it. Let's see what's inside. So here we have 4 groups. The main group is this percussion group that has 16 sounds. Only 7 of them are actually used. And here we have 3 additional groups with just 1 sound inside each of them. Okay, so what we're going to do is split this pattern into 7 different patterns that we can then drag onto the projects in Ableton, so we can ignore the patterns in Maschine, even disable them or clean them out, and move our workflow completely over to Ableton Live. So the first thing you want to do is create 15 additional MIDI tracks. And all of those MIDI tracks need to have external instruments on them. So let's load one onto this track. Um, now we want to send to this instance of Maschine. And for this first track, we want to send our MIDI to Maschine 2, to channel 2 rather, and receive audio from channel 2. So this one's set up. Let's just duplicate that a few times so we have 4 more instances. Okay, duplicate. Now we have 8, duplicate 12, duplicate 16, and remove the last one since we only need 15 additional tracks. Let's hide the return channels real quick. Hide the browser for now. Do some house cleaning. Give them all the same color as the original Maschine instance. So basically we now have 16 MIDI tracks, the first of which contains Maschine, and all the other 15 contain external instruments. So let's go through these. Set this one to channel 3, the next to channel 4, and so on. I will not be editing this video, so you'll just have to sit through this. Where was I? 5, 6. So of course this is a bit fiddly, as you notice, but you can always make a template that you can reuse later on. Okay, so that's MIDI output and audio inputs set for the 15 additional channels. Let me check my notes here. Okay, so the next thing you might want to do, well actually it's necessary, especially if you have group effects in Maschine, you want to group all 16 tracks. Okay, now let me just check my Maschine, and I will create, I will rename these sounds according to the 16 pads in Maschine. So yeah, it will be a bit boring to sit through probably, but you will notice afterwards when we drag the pattern onto from Maschine onto Ableton, it's real handy to have all your tracks named. So here we go. Damn, actually I'm using the wrong names from the wrong instance. Okay, so I'll have to redo some. Okay, so that's the renaming done. Congratulations, you've made it through the most boring part. Let me just rename this to machine. Let's be original and call it machine. Okay, so that's all the tracks grouped and renamed. Now we open our instance of machine. If you remember, it's on the first group track, which is the first pad, in this case, the first kick inside of the set, inside of the group. So if we take a look here, we have the same exact names that were used to name these tracks in Ableton. Okay, so the first thing you want to do is go to group level, open the mixer. Excuse me. Don't go to group level, go to sound level. And then open the mixer. Let's increase the view. Okay. So first you want to select all the tracks and click this I/O button over here, so you can define the input and the output. As you might remember from the setup of the external instruments in Ableton Live, we want to receive MIDI from our host channel for all 16 channels. Oh. So from our host, Control A a second time to undo the selection. And now we go through the process of defining where our MIDI is coming from. So by default, machine receives on channel 1. So the instance that the first track in Ableton, so to speak, that's hosting the kick is kind of a special case. But basically, just go through, I skipped one, just go through all the channels and set our inputs to the same number as the number of the sounds. Okay, for the output, we don't want to go to the group, and that has some implications that I will get to in a minute. So as you can see, this takes a lot of time to set up. But once again, if you have an empty instance of machine, which I did not because I started from presets. If you have an empty instance, you can just create one, do all the setup in Ableton Live with a machine plugin, load it into a MIDI track, and you can save it as a template. So that's the setup of the mixer in machine done. Okay. I was talking about the fact that we have created an issue by sending our signals directly to the outputs instead of the group. Let me explain why that is. So you see all the sounds here are now routed directly to Ableton Live, but normally they would be directed, bussed together into this group that contains a maximizer and an ice plugin. You might have a situation where there's also stuff on the master group, but the fix that we will see for this workaround, it's the one that works for the group level also applies to the master level. Okay, so now that our routing through machine is done, we can drag and drop this pattern straight onto Ableton Live. You can use this button for it. I will move this over to my other screen. just drag and drop and drag it onto the first channel, being the kick in this case. Now, since I only had 7 of the 16 pads actually doing something, we get 7 tracks. By default, it puts them all right after each other, but as you can see, they're not mapped correctly. So we will fix that. Perk Blend 2 will go here. That's the reason why I took the time to rename the tracks in Ableton. So the cymbal goes here, snare 2 goes here, snare 1 and kick are in the correct position. Okay. Now we can basically delete this pattern or just enable it from scene, disable it from scene 1. So there will be no MIDI information generated by Maschine anymore to trigger these sounds. Rather, they will be generated from these 6 patterns. It sounds a bit different, possibly because I did something wrong with the external instruments or so. So I advise you to double check your work, especially if you're making a template for later use. But it might also be due to the fact that we're not having the maximizer and ice anymore, the group plugins that were in Maschine. Okay, so now obviously we need to fix that. You can see here that our 16 tracks have been grouped. That's not a coincidence, because now we can go to our plugins and load Maschine 2 effects. So just the effects section of Maschine onto the group. Okay, so that opens up. What we have to do now is just copy the situation that we had in Maschine. Let me put this a bit smaller. So what we need to do now is check out the group level effects, and maybe later on, if it's the case, also the master level effects. But here we only have the group. So I have a maximizer set to 42 and 24. So let's just here go to the group level. Doesn't actually matter where you put it. So maximizer 42 and 24. Sidechain inputs are untouched. Next we have an ice plugin. So we load up ice. Color is set to 65, mix is set to 1, and these are set to 0. So let's copy these settings over. There you go. So now we will find out if it was an actual mistake and one of the external instruments are just the missing group effects. Yeah, as you can see here, we now have no more sound. And you will see if I bypass the Maschine effects, the sound will return. Okay, so there's some additional setup to be done in Maschine effects, and it has to do with the fact that there's no input selected. Okay, so what you do to avoid this is just go to Sound 1, Channel Settings, Input, and here select Input 1. Now we should have our sound back. Okay, our sound is back, but there's still something not quite right. Let me see real quick if I can see where the mistake is too. These don't actually matter. Can't seem to find it. Let's go into Maschine real quick. Double check the mixer. So these are set to 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's the problem. Okay. Check the bottom row, the outputs, all set to external, the correct level. Let's try again. Okay, so that sounds better. Just the same as the original, if I remember correctly. One additional thing that you can do is open the original instance of Maschine. And my screen is messed up. Yeah, I just got a Maschine just over a week ago, so I'm kind of struggling. Okay. Oh no, it's not messed up at all. So now you can delete the instances of the two effects that you just copied over to Maschine effects. So that's just a bit of cleanup. Okay. Now we're not completely done because on this Maschine instance we have also 3 other groups that we can migrate. Of course, Maschine can only output 16 channels, so we're going to have to sacrifice 3 channels from our first group. But that's not really a problem because we're only using 7 sounds out of the 16, so we basically have 9 channels to spare. Okay. What I will do is just drag these last 3 out of the group. So that's 14, 15, and 16. Give them a blue color, just like in Maschine. And now we head back over to Maschine to rectify the situation. So let's go to the sounds of this first kit and just set audio to none, and also the MIDI input, best to set it to none. So basically this is just the same thing that we were doing in the mixer. So if I open up the mixer again, you can see on the last 3 channels that the output and inputs have been set to none and empty basically. Okay, so now let's go to this group, and our first sound here goes to host 14, output goes to 14. Here we also have 1 sound, so let's set this one to host 15 and 15. And here we have also 1 sound, host 16 and output 16. Okay. Now one final thing we have to do is drag the patterns from these 3 onto their respective tracks in Ableton. Okay. So once again, we use this button right here. First select the correct group, obviously, and then use this pattern to drag it over to Ableton. So that's 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's have a listen and check if these 3 channels are actually outputting something. Okay, it looks like they're all alive and well. Okay, so basically now we have full integration, full migration actually of the Maschine pattern onto separate channels in Ableton Live. And by grouping these first 15, we can add the group effects that were processing these 15 sounds. And these other 3 groups had no, these other 3 sounds in Maschine rather, had no group effects on them. So there's no reason to use them, to group them. Also, if there would have been effects on the master, you could just group the original group and the 3 separate sounds, group them again, and on this track right here we could load up Maschine effects, and we can copy our master effects onto this instance. But actually, let's undo that because it's not needed. Okay, so that's done, that's finished. The extra thing we can do is create a drum rack to link Ableton Push and the Maschine together, so that we can control Maschine from Ableton Push, as I showed you earlier in this video. So to do that, just create a new MIDI track. Go to your instruments, load the drum rack onto it. Okay, let's give it the same color and put it here. Okay. So next thing we need to do is we need to create an external instrument on each of these pads. Let me first configure the first one. So this is going to, what was it called? It's just called Maschine. It's kind of confusing. Oh, excuse me, it's called Kick 1. Why Kick 1? Because Kick 1 is the track that has the actual Maschine instance loaded into it. So Kick 1 and channel 1 for the first. The output actually doesn't matter because we're going to put the gain to minus infinite. Let me check my notes real quick. Okay. Now we just copy this external instrument over to all the other pads. For the sake of the length of this video, I will not be naming these pads, but it's actually good practice to rename them all and give them the same name as the sounds in Maschine, and also these tracks here in Ableton. So that's 2 done. You can do the other 14 if you're doing this yourself. Okay, just set the channel to 1 through 16. That's 7, 8, Actually, this is gonna be the last one because we don't have a track anymore for the last 3 sounds in the first group of machine because they were used up for the other 3 groups that were in the same machine instance. Obviously, if you put these groups in another instance, you can use 16 pads. Basically, the only limitation that you have really is the fact that there are only 16 channels per machine instance, so you can never create more than 16 tracks for one machine instance inside of Ableton Live. Okay, so if we now switch to push, you can see that we have our pads laid out. If I select the correct instance here, that's not the correct one. Yeah, I'm still struggling a bit with machine. All right, here it is. Matter of fact, let's go back into Ableton and delete these final 3 sounds because we chose to sacrifice them to the other 3 groups you see here. Okay, so if I now navigate to the machine drum rack, you can see that we have the same 13 pads on push as we have on machine, and we can trigger the sounds. You can even see them light up here. So what this allows us to do is create additional patterns straight from push or from Ableton Live, and add effects, do your mix down, do your mastering inside of Ableton if you're used to that, and still have full control over machine. You can still manipulate every sound. You can select the pad right here, go to the plugins, on sound level. This kick has a sampler, a lo-fi, and an EQ. If you want to add a reverb or whatever, you can still do it here. So you basically get all the possibilities that are provided in Ableton Live together with all the possibilities that are provided in machine. So one last thing I want to show you to wrap up this video, because I think my camera is gonna die on me anytime now. If we go back to Ableton Live, you can see that we have our drum rack right here, and you can basically record a pattern on here. So let me take this hi-hat sound, lock it to repeat, set it real fast so we can do something that that sticks out in the mix. So I now have the closed hi-hat selected of this group. Let me just check if so the closed hi-hat is not in use. Let's now use Ableton to create a pattern and load it onto this track right here. So let's see what we have recorded. Shiny. Let's turn it into a 2-bar loop. And now we can play everything together if you want. So you can see that there's no sound coming out of the actual drum rack. Why? Well, basically because we set the outputs of every external instrument to minus infinite decibels. But you will see that the closed hi-hat channel here will now output audio, even though there is no MIDI clip inside it. It's actually the MIDI clip in the drum rack that is sending its information to the closed hi-hat in Maschine, and the closed hi-hat in Maschine outputs it to this channel right here. So watch the closed hi-hat channel. It will give a signal here, even though there's no MIDI information. Okay. Now, if you want to migrate this pattern to the closed hi-hat, all you do is drag it over, and you need to do a little bit of editing because Maschine always expects a C3. So if we play it back now, I don't know if it will be obvious, but the closed hi-hat will sound about 2 octaves lower than it actually was when we recorded it. So you can hear that it's barely a hi-hat anymore. So let's just select everything, put it 2 octaves up, zoom in, and place it right on the C3. And now we should, let me solo it, we should get the exact same sound. Sounds more like what we recorded. Okay, so that's basically how you record, add to the pattern that you created in Maschine afterwards. How you add on to it and move your creations that you created with push over to the correct channel. You can also record the complete pattern here with 7 or 8 or whatever different instruments involved. Then drag the pattern that you have over to all 8 of these channels. Remove the 7 tracks from every clip that's not relevant. For example, if you have a clip here with a kick drum and a snare drum, you can copy it over to the kick drum and to the snare drum and just remove the snare drum from this channel, remove the kick drum from this channel. Whatever remains, transpose it to C3, and you have your complete pattern migrated to these tracks. One other thing of note to wrap up this video is when we return to push rather, you will see that we have, let me just unsolo this. Okay, so here we have our, all the way to the right is our drum rack. These other 3 groups had chromatic sounds inside them. The bass is most obvious. It's not a bass actually, I just forgot to rename these tracks. But you can hear that it follows a chromatic scale right here. So whatever sound you had in Maschine and you were playing chromatically there, you can play chromatically in Ableton through your push. And even for the percussive sounds, if you play a C3, you can just hear the sound as it was used, as it was programmed in the pattern, but you can also play the kick or whatever sound chromatically. So that wraps up this video. If you enjoyed it and if you learned something, please consider subscribing to the channel. This is my first tutorial video. I might do more if they turn out to be popular. And I also create a track every month or every 2 months or so. So you can check that out whenever I upload a new video. Okay, thanks for watching and see you around. So I was reviewing the video I did yesterday, and I noticed that I forgot to mention one last thing. And also, I would like to explain the using of the patterns rather in Ableton a bit further. So what I showed you that we would end up with is in the previous video is this this project right here. And as you can see, we have a mixture of red and green tracks from left to right. That's intentional because I wanted to put all my kicks next to each other, put all my snares next to each other, and so on. So there's 2 kicks in every instance, there's 2 snares in every instance. So that's why I have them laid out like this. It provides a better overview of the project. Okay. Well, if we return to the project we did yesterday, you will see that there's it's not possible to rearrange the different channels in this way. What you see here is basically what we did yesterday. I just renamed this track to Machine 1A because it's group A, the first group in the first instance of Machine. And I also forgot to rename these 3, group B, C, and D from the first Machine instance. And also I split up the 16 pads in the second Machine instance using the same procedure. So we have here our second Machine instance, and here we have a second Machine effects instance running the effects that were originally on the second Machine instance. Okay, but since they're grouped, we can't really rearrange them. If we want to keep the sound exactly the same, we also can just drag kick 1 from Machine 2 into the Machine 1 group for the simple reason that the group effects are different. So if we take a look at the group effects from the first machine, which we migrated yesterday, you can see there's a maximizer set to 42 and 24 and an ice plugin. And if we look at the Machine effects instance on the second machine, we will see that there is some performer effects and a maximizer with different settings. So the change in the maximizer, the difference in the maximizer settings make it so that we can't really drag over sounds because they will pass through a different Machine effects plugin if we do that. So to resolve that issue, you just need to create 2 additional audio tracks. So this red audio track will be our Machine 1 bus, which we will send all the audio to, and this second instance will be our Machine 2 bus. So let me rename those. For these tracks, you also want to set the monitoring to internal. So click the in button here. Okay. Now we're going to send the audio from these 13 pads over to the bus we just created. We're gonna lose the group once we ungroup these tracks. So we first need to copy or cut, doesn't matter, the instance of Machine effects to the bus, from the group to the bus. Do the same for the second group. So copy Machine effects from the second group, paste them onto the second bus. Okay, now we can go ahead and ungroup our tracks. So once I hit ungroup tracks on the second machine instance, we will effectively lose the machine effects plugin that was on the group, but that's no problem because we will write everything to this bus and we have a copy of the machine effects on this bus. So ungroup tracks. And if everything goes well, we should still have the exact same sound. And we will see here in these two audio channels that machine 1, all sounds from the machine 1 instance will pass through here, and all sounds from the machine 2 instance will pass through here. So let's check it. Looks like I missed something. Oh yeah, of course. Our audio from our 13 pads here is now, since we ungrouped it, it's the audio is sent straight to the master, and we want to send it to the machine 1 bus. Same thing for the kick. For the second machine instance, just select all 16 channels and change audio 2 from master to machine 2 bus. So now we should see these two audio tracks coming to life. Okay, so now we still have the original sound, just like we created the machine, and we now have the possibility to rearrange these tracks. So if I want to put my kicks next to each other, I can just drag and drop them wherever I want them. I thought there was a second kick here as well, yes. Okay, so we now have our 4 kicks grouped. And of course you can do the same for the snares and the heads and stuff like that. Okay, so one additional thing that I wanted to show you is how to use the patterns in the drum rack and the individual sounds. I showed it yesterday in the push environment, but I didn't find it very clear, so I will do the same explanation in the software. So, well, basically, if you select the drum rack, you can play all these pads and hear the sounds. And if you want to create a completely new pattern from scratch, so let's create a basic pattern with just the kick and the snare, you can go ahead and create your pattern. Something like this. Let's put it on the second scene. Okay, so once you have created a pattern with more than one sound on it, you can drag it onto the appropriate sounds. So that's kick 1 and snare 1 in this instance. And as you zoom in, you will notice that the kick is on C1, the snare is on C#1. Obviously, for the kick channel, we want to hear only the kick sound, so we delete the snare sound. For the snare sound, it's the other way around. We don't want to send the MIDI information from the kick, but only the MIDI information from the snare. The last thing we need to do now is transpose it up to C3, because machine always expects a C3. So now here on the second scene we have 2 clips distilled from the one clip we made right here inside of the machine drum rack, and if we play it we will see that we just have our kick and snare. So obviously the choice is yours. You can if you have a pattern here, you can drag it onto the next scene and put some extra information for this particular step sound, or create variations or whatever. So you can mix and match what you have exported from Maschine with what you record here on the drum rack. Now for the chromatic sounds, we you can see that, well, this is just a single note now, but you can program a pattern, a melodic pattern in here with different notes. Program it or record it using push or an external keyboard or whatever you have. So that's a possibility. And also, you can even, as I mentioned yesterday, you can even play the hi-hat chromatically if you want, by just creating a clip right onto the closed hi-hat. Obviously, you can't play the hi-hat chromatically from the drum rack, because in the drum rack you only have one pad to control it. But if you create a clip right onto the track, you can play the hi-hats just like they would come out of Maschine if you played the Maschine pads, by creating notes on C3. So let's play that. So the pitch you're hearing here is exactly the same as the pitch you would hear if you were to press the corresponding pad on your Maschine, or the corresponding pad on your drum rack right here. Now, say you want to play this hi-hat chromatically, you can just transpose the notes to the positions where they need to be, and now you know that you're 2 semitones above the pitch that can be played through Maschine via the pads. So it sounds like this. Let's make it a bit more extreme. So there's that. That's just something I wanted to clarify. Okay, that wraps up this video. Thank you for watching.